Usually when we talk about a map, there is this underlying expectation of absolute precision, right? Like,
Uh-huh.
we are so conditioned by modern engineering.
Oh,
You
uh-huh.
open an app on your phone and you see that glowing blue dot. You see the rigid, mathematically perfect lines of the roads, the exact boundaries of a country.
Right, right.
And the high-resolution satellite image just points and says, there it is. This is reality.
It's binary. I mean,
Yeah.
it is visually absolute.
Yeah. It's either land or water. It's paved or unpaved. It's just clean.
Yeah. And, well, psychologically speaking, it is highly comforting. As a modern society, we really like things to be visible, to be categorized.
Yeah.
And most importantly, we like to be the ones who categorize them, with our modern instruments.
Yeah, we like to feel like we're in control of the geography, but
Exactly.
then you step into the world of ancient histories, specifically the history of the Indian subcontinent, and suddenly that comforting modern satellite map feels like it is missing a massive fundamental piece of the
A
puzzle.
huge piece.
Right. We're looking at a historical and geographical landscape that is, well, honestly, it's murky. And today, we are diving straight into those murky waters for this deep dive to answer one really profound question.
And it's a big one.
It is. The question is, was Aryavarta, which is a term you might have heard thrown around in historical and cultural discussions, was it just an imagined land found in old poems and myths? Or did it have a concrete, scientifically verifiable, and geographical foundation?
To truly understand why this question is so vital for you to consider, we have to establish the historical context of, well, who was actually reading these texts for the past couple of centuries?
Right, because the interpretation really matters here.
Exactly. For a very long time, specifically during the colonial era, the prevailing methodology for analyzing ancient indigenous texts was one of profound, almost systemic skepticism.
Just totally dismissing them out of hand.
Pretty much. When 19th century European scholars and historians began translating these massive Sanskrit texts, they brought with them a very specific Eurocentric lens.
Meaning, they had a rigid idea of what a map should look like. And these ancient texts just didn't look like European maps.
Exactly. Ancient indigenous texts were very often dismissed as pure imagination or spiritual allegory. The assumption was that early civilizations simply did not possess the capacity for grand-scale geographical surveying.
So they thought they were just making it up.
Right. So if a text described a sprawling, continent-wide landscape or a river of, impossible gargantuan size, colonial-era historians would immediately file it under mythology or poetry or religious hyperbole.
Wow.
Yeah. It was rarely, if ever, treated as a hard geographical record.
Right. It was viewed as a fairy tale, a metaphor for, I don't know, spiritual enlightenment perhaps, but certainly not a literal map you could use to actually navigate.
Precisely. However, the mission of our deep dive today is to look at these texts completely impartially.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that for you listening. We aren't here to take any sides or endorse any specific ideologies today, whether they be left-wing or right-wing interpretations of history.
No, not at all. Our goal is to strip away the centuries of interpretive bias and simply look at what the source material actually
And
says.
it's the raw data.
Exactly. And when you examine these ancient texts without that colonial skepticism, you find highly specific, coordinate-based geographical boundaries.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And the most incredible part, we are now in an era where we can take those ancient, supposedly poetic boundaries and actually test them against modern space-age technology.
And this is the core of what we are doing today, because the ultimate aha moment of this deep dive, the thing that absolutely shifted my entire paradigm when we were going through the source material, is that a legendary, massive, supposedly mythological river has now been scientifically proven to exist.
It's just amazing.
It is, and not just exist, but it's been found buried right under a modern desert, holding secrets that fundamentally rewrite how we view ancient cartography.
It is a perfect collision of the ancient and the ultramodern. I mean, we are using orbital satellites to read Sanskrit poetry.
That's such a great way to put it. Let's break down the mechanics of that, because to understand how groundbreaking this modern scientific confirmation is, we first have to establish exactly what these ancient texts were claiming in the first place.
Right. We have to start with the macro view, the broadest borders of this land of Aryavarta.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, if we are going to test the geographical knowledge of ancient peoples, we need to look at their largest, most audacious claims. This brings us to a foundational text known as the Manusmriti.
The Manusmriti. Okay.
Yes. Specifically, we are looking at chapter 2, verse 22. When you read this verse, you realize immediately that This isn't a vague, flowery description of a magical ethereal kingdom. It is a precise delineation of geographical boundaries defining the physical landmass of Aryavarta.
And what are those exact parameters? Like, what are the borders?
The Manusmriti details that Aryavarta is the land stretching from the Eastern Ocean, which we know today as the Bay of Bengal, all the way across the subcontinent to the Western Ocean, which is the Arabian Sea.
Okay, so it's coast to coast.
Exactly. But it doesn't stop with just an east-to-west axis. It also provides the north-to-south axis. It states quite literally that this land is situated between the Himalayas in the north and the Vindhya Mountains in the south.
So from the Bay of Bengal to the Arabian Sea and the Himalayas down to the Vindhyas.
What's fascinating here is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of geographical awareness required to map this out. I mean, we're talking about people living thousands and thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
They didn't have high-altitude balloons. They didn't have drones or, basic surveying equipment.
Right. No Google Earth.
None of that.
Yeah.
Yet, they possessed a perfectly accurate mental and perhaps physical map of the entire upper half of the Indian subcontinent. They knew about both oceans flanking the massive landmass, and they understood the exact positioning of these continent-defining mountain ranges.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because I want to push back slightly on how impressive this macro view actually is.
Sure.
Because it's one thing to say ocean to ocean, mountain to mountain. If you're a nomadic culture or you have traders walking trade routes for generations, eventually someone is going to say, hey, there's a giant body of water that way and a giant body of water the other way.
Right. Word gets around.
Exactly. Couldn't that just be a really broad generalization by ancient travelers? It feels a bit like someone in the 1700s drawing a map of America by just waving their hands and saying, well, it goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
That's a good analogy.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean they actually know what the interior geography looks like. It could just be a broad guess.
That is a very fair point, and frankly, it is exactly the kind of skepticism that colonial historians applied. If it's just water to water, it could easily be dismissed as a generalization. But I want you, the listener, to really imagine trying to map out a continent without GPS, without planes, without even a standardized magnetic compass, just establishing that the eastern water and the western water are two distinct bounding oceans of a single continuous landmass is a profound leap in spatial awareness.
That's true. They had to know it wasn't just a big lake.
Right. It requires synthesizing generations of observational skills from countless early travelers, aggregating that data and condensing it into a single, cohesive geographical concept.
It's essentially crowdsourced cartography playing out over centuries.
Exactly. But your pushback regarding the interior geography is entirely valid. Broad borders are relatively easy to theorize if you walk far enough.
Yeah.
If the Manusmriti provides the macro view, the grand sweeping borders of Aryavarta, the natural question becomes, do other texts provide the micro view? Do they zoom in and offer internal coordinates?
Right, because if I tell you I live between Canada and Mexico, and between the Atlantic and the Pacific, I've told you I live in the United States, but I haven't proven I actually know anything about the topography inside it.
Exactly.
I could still be completely guessing about where the rivers and forests are.
And this is where the source material gets remarkably granular, leaving no room for the argument that they were just guessing.
Yeah.
To answer your pushback, we have to look at two other ancient texts,
Okay, what are they?
the Vashista Dharma Sutra and the Bodhayan Dharma Sutra.
The Dharma Sutras.
Yes. And these texts provide a much, much more specific, localized definition of Aryavarta. They state that Aryavarta is the land north of the Paryatra and Vindhya mountains and south of the Himalayas.
Okay, so we still have the Himalayan and Vindhya mountain boundaries functioning as the north and south walls.
We do, but then they add two highly specific, localized landmarks on the east-west axis. The texts state that Aryavarta is located west of a place called Kalakavana, which translates to the Black Forest.
The Black Forest, okay.
And most crucially for our deep dive today, it states that Aryavarta is located east of a very specific, peculiar location called Vinasana.
Vinasana.
Yes. And the texts define Vinasana very clearly. It is the exact physical location where the great Saraswati River disappears into the desert sand.
Okay, wait. Here's where it gets really interesting, but also where I have to play devil's advocate again.
Go for it.
Establishing that the river disappeared in the texts isn't enough to prove it was a real place, right?
Hmm.
When you say a disappearing river, like a giant body of water that just vanishes into the sand, that sounds exactly like the kind of mythological fantasy the colonial era historians warned us about.
This sounds fantastical.
Right, like, oh, look at these ancient people. They believed in a mystical river that just vanished into thin air. It sounds like a metaphor for the fleeting nature of life or a religious allegory about the underworld. It doesn't sound like a rigid map coordinate.
It sounds incredibly poetic.
Yeah.
And if you are reading it through a lens that assumes these texts are purely mythological, if you're reading it as literature rather than data, you would absolutely conclude that a disappearing river is a metaphor.
Exactly.
But here is what impartial analysis of these texts reveals. The authors of the Dharma Sutras do not treat Vinasana as a magical event. They do not describe it as a mystical portal to another realm.
They treat it as a mundane fact.
They treat it as a fixed, reliable, geographical waypoint. You have to remember what the Dharma Sutras are. They are texts dealing with dharma, law, custom, and societal rules.
Oh, so they're legal texts.
They are essentially ancient legal and social frameworks. They are using Vinasana as a practical, jurisdictional navigational tool.
Wait, really?
Yes. The text is essentially saying the laws and customs of Aryavarta apply west of the Black Forest, and they apply east to the exact spot where the water of the Saraswati sinks into the sand. That is your jurisdictional border. You cannot use a metaphor as a border for a physical, legal territory.
Oh, wow. That makes total sense. You don't tell someone, my property line ends where hope dies.
You're very
You
right.
say, my property line ends at the big oak tree. They were using Vinasana as the big oak tree.
Precisely.
Yep.
If a civilization is using the disappearance point of a river to legally or culturally define their borders in texts like the Dharma Sutras, it strongly implies that this disappearance point was a stark, undeniable, and permanent physical reality for the people living there. It was a landmark you could walk to and literally point at.
But a river disappearing into a desert still feels scientifically weird, which means if a river that large actually dried up there, the ground itself has to show the scars, right?
It does.
So how do we look under a desert to find them? Because we aren't just doing literary analysis anymore. We are moving from the poetry of the ancient world to the hard empirical science of the modern world to test whether this river was a physical reality or a myth.
This is where we introduce the modern scientific heroes of this story. We're talking about ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, and the NRSD, the National Remote Sensing Center.
India's space agency and their remote sensing wing.
Yes. They deployed modern satellite imagery to look at the exact geographical area described in these ancient texts, the modern-day Thar Desert. Specifically, they utilized List 3 and IVES technology.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that for the listener. Because when we hear satellite imagery, we usually just think of Google Earth. We think of a high-resolution optical photograph taken from low Earth orbit.
Right, just a very good camera.
Exactly. But this isn't just taking a picture of the sand, is it? List 3 and IWEVs have to be doing something fundamentally different if they are looking under a desert.
It is much, much more profound than standard optical photography. List 3 stands for Linear Imaging Self-Scanning Sensor, and IWEFS is the Advanced Wide Field Sensor.
Okay.
These are highly advanced remote sensing technologies. They don't just capture the visible light spectrum that our human eyes see. They're designed to detect different wavelengths, specifically in the near-infrared and shortwave infrared spectrums.
So they're seeing invisible light.
Exactly. They are measuring things like thermal inertia, subtle variations in the Earth's surface temperature, and deep moisture levels that hint at what lies buried beneath the topsoil. They are looking for the geological signatures of fluvial geomorphology.
Fluvial geomorphology, that's a mouthful.
It just means the ways in which water shapes the Earth.
Oh, got it. So it's less like an X-ray and more like using an infrared camera to see where a heating pipe is leaking behind your drywall.
Yes.
You can't see the pipe with your naked eye because the drywall is in the way, but the infrared camera detects the temperature and moisture ghosts of the pipe left in the wall. So the satellite is detecting the moisture ghosts of the river left in the sand.
That is a brilliant and highly accurate analogy. When a river flows for thousands of years, it does more than just move water. It carves a deep physical trench, a scar, into the bedrock.
Right.
And as it flows, it deposits distinct materials, alluvial sediments, specific types of gravel and dense clay. These materials have a fundamentally different composition than the aeolian sand, the wind-blown sand of a typical desert.
So even when the river dies, the bed it slept in remains.
Exactly. Even when the water dries up completely, and even when thousands of years of shifting desert dunes blow over it, completely hiding it from the naked eye of anyone walking on the surface, that geological scar remains.
And the satellites can see that scar?
Yes. The buried alluvial clay and gravel have a different thermal inertia than the surrounding desert sand. They retain microscopic amounts of deep moisture differently. The density is different. It even affects the subtle vigor of sparse surface vegetation. And the LIS-3 and AWIF sensors can detect those minute variations from orbit.
That is just so cool. And what did those moisture ghosts reveal? When ISR pointed those sensors at the Thar Desert, what did they actually see?
The remote sensing data uncovered a massive, undeniable paleochannel buried deep beneath the sands.
A paleochannel, meaning the ancient fossilized path of a dried-up river system.
Exactly. And they didn't just find a fragmented creek. They found a massive, continuous paleochannel system spanning across both modern-day India and Pakistan, running right through the heart of the Thar Desert.
Wow.
And it perfectly aligns with the geographical coordinates and descriptions found in the ancient texts.
Just imagine being the scientist sitting at the NRSC looking at that satellite data. You're looking at a monitor, interpreting pixelated data of near-infrared moisture and sediment signatures, and suddenly the pattern connects. You realize you are looking at the fossilized ghost of the Saraswati River.
I'm sure it was a breathtaking moment. The profound significance of this discovery cannot be overstated in the fields of archaeology and history. Modern remote sensing has entirely vindicated the geography of the Dharmasutras and the Manusmriti.
It wasn't a myth.
The missing river, the disappearing river of Vinasana, wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a colonial-era fairy tale about the fleeting nature of existence. It was a hard, empirical, geological reality just waiting for the human race to invent the right technology to spot it from space.
It's almost like the Earth kept the receipt.
It really did.
The ancients wrote it down in their legal codes, the Earth buried the physical evidence beneath dunes, and we finally built an orbital scanner sensitive enough to read it.
It's incredible.
But here is where we need to look at the timeline and the data, because we aren't just talking about a little seasonal creek that dried up in a drought. Now that the river's existence is proven by the satellites, we have to talk about the staggering scale of the river they discovered.
We do.
Because the size of this paleochannel aligns perfectly with the oldest ancient descriptions, right?
Yes. The scale is truly difficult to wrap your head around, and it requires us to look at the hydrology of the region during a very specific window of time. The data from the scientific studies places the absolute peak of this river system during the Vedic period.
And for context, so you, the listener, can place this on a mental timeline, when are we talking?
We are talking about a climatic window roughly 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. This was the Holocene climatic optimum, a period when the monsoon patterns over the Indian subcontinent were significantly more robust.
10,000 to 8,000 years ago, literally the dawn of human civilization as we know it.
During that era, the scientific data based on the width of the alluvial deposits in the paleochannels shows that at its peak, this mighty Himalayan river was between 4 to 10 kilometers wide.
Wait, 4 to 10 kilometers wide?
Yes.
Just for context, the Mississippi River at its widest navigable point is only about 1.5 kilometers. You're talking about a river more than 6 times that size, moving violently through what is now an arid desert.
It's massive.
If you are standing on one bank of a 10-kilometer wide river, the other bank is just a hazy, indistinct line on the horizon. It's essentially an inland sea that is constantly moving.
It was a true hydrological behemoth. It was a Goliath of a river system. And again, we go back to the text for confirmation of this scale. The Rigveda, which is one of the oldest known continuous texts in human history, specifically referred to the Saraswati River extensively in its hymns.
And what did they call it?
Well, the specific Sanskrit term they used to describe it was Naditama.
Natitama. What is the literal translation of that?
It translates directly to the best of rivers, or the greatest of rivers.
Greatest rivers.
Yes. For a very long time, historians and philologists thought Naditama was just religious hyperbole. They assumed it was ancient people exaggerating the size of a local, seasonal stream to make their regional deity seem more powerful and majestic.
Because that's what ancient people do, right? They embellish.
That was the assumption. But the satellite imagery from ISRO confirms that the massive scale described in the ancient texts is a 100% match with the geological width of the paleochannels.
That's insane.
When the authors of the Rigveda called it the greatest of rivers, they weren't being poetic. They weren't using hyperbole. They were being literal.
They were just stating an observable fact, like, hey, look at that river. It's 10 kilometers wide. It is demonstrably the greatest river on the continent.
Precisely. It was a factual, empirical observation of their immediate environment.
And this brings us to an incredibly tangible point that I really want to emphasize for you listening. Because it's one thing to see a fossilized ghost river on a high-tech monitor at a space agency.
Right.
It's academically fascinating, but it can feel very disconnected from daily human life. But there is a modern practical utility to this discovery that is just staggering.
It really is life-changing.
Right. Because when modern engineers and geologists took this satellite data and they actually went out into the Thar Desert, this incredibly harsh, arid landscape where surface water is practically non-existent, and they dug deep tube wells straight down into these invisible paleochannels, they didn't just find dry dirt and old, dusty gravel.
No, they didn't. The results of those drilling expeditions were revolutionary.
They hit massive pressurized reservoirs of sweet, drinkable water.
The hydrology of paleochannels is truly remarkable. When a 10-kilometer wide river flows for thousands of years, it doesn't just carve a channel on the surface, it heavily saturates the deep, porous aquifers deep beneath the bedrock.
Like a giant sponge.
Exactly. Even when the surface water eventually stops flowing and the desertification process claims the surface topography, that ancient, pristine water remains trapped deep underground. The thick layers of alluvial clay and the massive sand dunes above it actually act as a protective seal, preventing the water from evaporating.
I really want you to ponder the reality of this for a second. You have people living today in a modern, unforgiving desert. Water scarcity is a daily existential threat. And they are able to find life-saving, sweet, drinkable water simply by following the geographical directions left in a 10,000-year-old poem, which was then verified by a satellite in low Earth orbit.
It completely bridges a gap of 10 millennia. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that oral traditions and ancient texts can serve as vast, highly accurate repositories of empirical data.
They really can.
They encoded the literal location of the continent's largest water source into their daily hymns and legal codes, and miraculously the water is still there, waiting in the dark.
It is the ultimate survival guide, passed down through hundreds of generations, disguised as a religious text. But establishing the sheer scale of this, a 10-kilometer-wide river, leads us to the deepest geological mystery of our deep dive today.
Yes, the big question.
If the river was that massive, a hydrological behemoth, how does it just die? You don't just misplace an inland sea.
You really don't.
We're talking about an amount of water that literally dictates the climate of an entire region. Did it just evaporate?
Yeah.
Did the Holocene climatic optimum end, the climate got incredibly hot, and it just boiled away over a few centuries?
Well, climate change and the end of the Holocene optimum certainly played a role in the broader aridification of the region over the millennia.
Okay.
But a river of that specific staggering size and origin, you have to remember it's a Himalayan river, primarily fed by massive permanent glaciers, not just seasonal monsoons. It doesn't just evaporate into nothingness simply because the rainfall decreases.
So what happened?
The geological mechanisms responsible for the river's death are far more violent and dramatic. We're looking at massive tectonic shifts.
Tectonic shifts, so like earthquakes,
Yeah.
the ground actually moving and swallowing the river.
Earthquakes are the sudden, violent expressions of tectonic shifts, yes. But we are talking about the slow, immense, grinding movement of the Earth's crust over centuries. You have to look at the broader plate tectonics of the region. The entire Indian subcontinent is resting on a massive tectonic plate that is constantly, inexorably pushing north, grinding into the Eurasian plate.
Which is exactly what created and continues to elevate the Himalayan mountain range.
Exactly. It is one of the most geologically active collision zones on the planet.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this. How does a mountain moving even slowly stop a 10-kilometer-wide river?
It comes down to a concept known in fluvial geomorphology as river piracy, or river capture.
River piracy, that sounds intense.
It is. A river's flow, its very existence, is entirely dependent on gradient. Water simply follows the path of least resistance downhill.
Right, gravity.
If a massive tectonic shift occurs over several centuries, it can fundamentally alter the elevation of the Earth's surface. It creates immense uplift in the bedrock. If the land beneath the river's path tilts even a fraction of a degree, or more importantly, if the source tributaries high up in the Himalayas are physically diverted by massive rock uplift, the water's path is blocked or permanently redirected.
So the Earth basically buckled, the gradient changed, and the glacial water was forced to spill a different way. It was hijacked.
Hijacked is the perfect word. Tectonic activity in the Himalayas and the surrounding Sawalik Hills fundamentally altered the drainage patterns of northern India. The massive glacial tributaries that fed this 10-kilometer-wide Goliath were captured or pirated by other adjacent river systems.
Where did the water go?
Specifically, geological evidence suggests the Yamuna River captured the eastern tributaries, taking that water to the Ganges, while the Sutlej River captured the western tributaries, taking that water to the Indus.
So the Saraswati's lifelines were completely severed by the Earth moving.
Yes. Cut off from its massive, reliable glacial water supply, the Saraswati was left relying solely on seasonal monsoon rains, which, as we discussed, were already declining due to broader climate changes. The river began to shrink drastically.
It didn't happen overnight in one massive earthquake. It was a slow strangulation over centuries.
A slow geological strangulation. And this brings us right back to the text of the Dharma Sutras and the concept of Vinasana, the disappearance point.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going.
As the water supply dwindled, the river simply lacked the hydraulic power to push all the way across the subcontinent to the Western Ocean, as it once did. It began to lose its battle against the encroaching desert sands.
Because it just didn't have the momentum anymore.
Exactly. It would flow down from the mountains, enter the arid plains, and eventually the volume of water was so low that it simply sank into the porous ground, disappearing into the sand.
That is incredible. So when the authors of the Dharma Sutras describe Vinasana, they aren't describing the river at its peak. They are describing the river in its dying phase. They are literally bearing witness to the tectonic strangulation of the Naditama.
Precisely. They are documenting a specific phase in a massive geological event. And what is truly remarkable is that we have the latest, hard, archaeological evidence supporting this exact timeline of decline.
We have actual physical evidence of the people who lived through this.
Yes. It comes from the Archaeological Survey of India, or ASI. They recently conducted extensive excavations at a site called Bahaj Village, located in the modern state of Rajasthan, right along the path of the paleochannel.
Because if the river was dying, there has to be a human footprint of that panic, right?
Absolutely.
People don't just sit there while their 10-kilometer river dries up and turns into a seasonal stream. They have to adapt or they have to move. Are there archaeological sites that show this societal collapse or adaptation? What exactly did they find in Bahaj Village?
The ASI uncovered highly significant archaeological evidence dating back roughly 4,500 years. And you hit the nail on the head regarding the human footprint. What they found at Bahaj Village perfectly reflects a society desperately adapting to severe aridification.
What did that look like?
Well, they didn't find a sprawling, prosperous, water-rich metropolis. They found evidence of profound shifts in settlement patterns.
Meaning they were abandoning the big cities?
Yes. As the river dried up and fragmented, the large, centralized urban centers, typical of the mature Harappan civilization, could no longer be sustained. The excavations at Bahaj show a transition towards smaller, scattered agricultural outposts.
People just spreading out to try and find whatever water was left.
Exactly. We also see physical evidence in the infrastructure. The ASI found abandoned wells that had been dug deeper and deeper over time, indicating a desperate attempt to chase the falling water table as the river retreated underground.
Wow. Digging deeper just to survive.
Furthermore, there are shifts in the artifacts themselves, changes in pottery styles and agricultural tools that suggest a shift away from water-intensive crops like wheat and barley toward more drought-resistant crops like millets.
4,500 years ago. Okay, let's do the math on the timeline here.
Sure.
The river was at its peak, 10 kilometers wide, between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago during the composition of the Rigveda. So by 4,500 years ago, when the people at Bahaj Village are desperately digging deeper wells.
By 4,500 years ago, the landscape was radically, fundamentally different. The tectonic shifts and river piracy had already done massive, irreversible damage to the river system.
He was already gone.
Basically, yes. The excavations at Bahaj Village capture a snapshot of a society living in the direct aftermath of those tectonic shifts. They're the people who watched the 10-kilometer-wide life-giving river turn into a shrinking, disappearing stream, ending at Vinasana, before eventually becoming nothing more than a buried paleochannel.
That timeline is just It's a massive amount of history to wrap your head around. But it makes so much logical sense when you put all the pieces together. The ancient texts aren't just a single static snapshot.
No, they're not.
They are a continuous generational record of a changing planet. The Rigveda captures the river in its prime when it's the 10-kilometer wide Nadatama. The Dharma Sutras capture it centuries or millennia later when tectonic shifts have reduced it and it's disappearing into the sand at Vinasana.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it tells a profoundly moving story about human resilience, observation, and memory. Tectonic shifts can rewrite the geography of an entire civilization. They could literally buckle the earth and hide a river from the world.
Yeah.
But the memory of that river, meticulously encoded in the legal codes and hymns of these texts, survived the geological upheaval.
It survived the tectonic shifts, it survived the brutal desertification of the region, and it survived the intense skepticism of colonial historians who tried to say it was all just a made-up spiritual metaphor.
It survived all of it.
That is just beautiful. It really is. It's a testament to the fact that our ancestors were incredibly keen scientific observers of their physical reality. They meticulously documented the river before, during, and after the Earth literally moved beneath their feet to hide it from them.
It is a phenomenal synthesis of human observation spanning millennia. If we summarize the core themes of what we've uncovered today, it all comes down to the immense value of impartial, multidisciplinary analysis.
Exactly.
When we take the Manusmriti, the Vishista Dharma Sutra, the Baudhayana Dharma Sutra, and the Rigveda, and we look at them not as primitive myths or fairy tales, but as potential empirical data sets.
And then we bounce that ancient data off the near-infrared sensors of IRIS-LIS-3 and AWIF satellites orbiting the Earth.
Exactly. When we combine the generational knowledge of ancient texts with the precision of modern space-age data, the result is completely undeniable. The boundaries of Aryavarta, from the oceans to the mountains, and the massive scale of the Saraswati River ending at Vinasana were precise, factual geographical realities. They were not colonial-era myths.
And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment as we wrap this up, because learning this completely changes our perspective on human history, doesn't it?
It really does.
It forces us to fundamentally respect the intellect and the observational science of the people who came before us. Again, we aren't taking political sides here. We aren't claiming one group's history or ideology is superior to another's. We are simply stepping back and letting the ancient texts and the modern satellite data speak for themselves.
And what they're saying, in perfect, verifiable unison, is that the map was real. The massive 10-kilometer river was real.
The sweet water trapped in the deep aquifers beneath the desert is real.
Yes, the water is real, and it's saving lives today.
Which leaves me with a thought I really want you to mull over. It's something I've been thinking about ever since we started looking at this source material for this deep dive. If a 10-kilometer wide river can be completely swallowed by the buckling of the earth, buried under millions of tons of desert sand, and entirely dismissed and forgotten as a myth, until our satellites finally found its moisture ghosts thousands of years later, what other fairy tales, legends, or myths told by our ancestors are actually highly accurate, desperately important survival guides, just waiting for us to invent the right technology to decode them?
It really makes you wonder what else we've arrogantly dismissed as primitive imagination, simply because we don't have the right infrared camera to see through the walls of history yet.